The morning light pooled on the floorboards, warm and still. Astra held the brass watering can,
tilting it with steady, practiced precision. Water trickled into the soil of the ferns, dark and rhythmic against the dry earth. He watched the leaves shift, droplets clinging to the fronds like glass beads. The study held its breath. There was no hum of traffic, no distant chatter, only the soft scrape of the metal spout against the ceramic pot. He set the can down on the desk. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, stained with ink and time. Astra stood for a moment, listening. He looked toward the window, watching the dust motes dance in the shafts of light. Everything in the room had its place. Everything was silent, balanced, and waiting. He wiped his hands on a cloth, the fabric stiff and clean. The air smelled of damp earth and old paper. He turned away from the plants, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was ready for the day, though he did not yet know what it would bring to his door. The stillness broke. A knock sounded at the door, not rhythmic or polite, but sharp, singular, and urgent. Astra did not move immediately. He let the sound echo against the bookshelves, letting it settle into the room. He watched the heavy wood panel. The silence returned for 3 seconds, then the knock repeated, faster this time. Astra walked to the door and pulled it open. Kai stood on the threshold. His posture was a jagged line of tension, shoulders pulled high toward his ears as if bracing for a blow. He did not look up. His gaze remained locked on his own boots, his toes shifting nervously against the floorboards. He seemed to be holding his breath, his chest tight and shallow. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, afraid to step forward, yet unable to turn back. He hovered in the doorway, caught between the hallway he had left and the sanctuary he had found. Every muscle in his frame was coiled, vibrating with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He finally leaned his weight against the doorframe, his knuckles white where he gripped his bag, staring intently at the floor. The hallway light spilled around him, casting a long shadow that reached toward Astra's feet. Kai remained fixed in place, his grip on the doorframe tightening until his fingernails pressed deep into the grain of the wood. The silence stretched, filled only by the faint, irregular rhythm of his breathing. Astra waited. He did not invite him in. He did not offer a greeting. He simply observed the way Kai's hands trembled, the way his jaw worked as if he were rehearsing words he was afraid to let loose. Finally, Kai lifted his head. His eyes were wide, darting around the study before snapping back to Astra. He seemed to be searching for something, a sign, a flaw, a reason to turn and run. His voice emerged as a thin, strained rasp. "They told me you are the one," he said, the words catching in his throat. He stopped, swallowed hard, and tried again. "Are you Astra, the one who understands what people feel?" He stood on the precipice of a confession, his entire body leaning forward, tethered to Astra by a single desperate question. He held his breath, waiting for the answer that would either anchor him or leave him drifting further into the dark. Astra nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that acknowledged the weight behind the question. He stepped back, gesturing toward the interior of the room, and closed the door behind them. Kai did not move toward the chair. He remained in the middle of the floor, his chest heaving as if he had just finished a long run. He pressed his palms against his temples, his fingers digging into his scalp. "I've not slept in 3 days," Kai said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. He paced a small circle, his eyes unfocused. The city outside is too loud. Not the traffic, not the shouting. It is the people. When I walk through the market, I feel their frustration, their hunger, their hidden grief. It crashes into me like a physical wave. It pushes against my ribs until I cannot breathe. He stopped and looked at his own hands, turning them over as if they belonged to a stranger. "I feel everything, and I do not know where I end and they begin. It is all mixed together, a mess of sensations that are not mine." He slumped, the energy leaving him as quickly as it had arrived, leaving him small and exposed in the center of the quiet study. Astra felt the familiar pull. It was an itch beneath his skin, a reflex honed over years of being the one who provided the answers. He stood by his desk, his mind already cataloging the steps. Deep diaphragmatic breathing, sensory grounding, the systematic separation of external stimuli from internal states. He took a breath to begin, his lips parting to offer the relief he knew would work. He had the words ready, the precise sequence of instructions that could calm the storm in front of him. But he stopped. He looked at Kai, who stood waiting for a command, and realized that providing a map would only keep the man dependent on his guidance. Astra closed his mouth. He exhaled slowly, letting the urge to solve, to fix, and to instruct dissipate into the quiet of the room. He shifted his weight, pressing his back against the cool wood of the desk, and folded his arms. He forced his muscles to relax. He did not offer a technique. He did not provide a solution. Instead, he simply looked at the chair, gesturing for Kai to sit. He chose to witness the struggle rather than intervene. The silence between them shifted. No longer a vacuum waiting to be filled with advice, but a space for Kai to exist without being managed. Astra felt the silence stretch, thin and brittle. His hands twitched at his sides, a residual desire to reach for a notebook or a pen, to document the problem rather than inhabit it. He glanced toward the corner. Sol stood by the bookshelf, her posture impossible to read. She was perfectly still, her hands resting lightly on a leather-bound spine, her gaze fixed not on the books, but on the space between Astra and his guest. She did not speak. She did not offer a nod of approval. She simply existed as a constant, unmoving point in the center of his volatile study. Her stillness acted as a mirror for the atmosphere he was trying to cultivate. Whenever Astra felt his focus waver, whenever the temptation to lecture returned, the sight of her calm, shadowed profile pulled his attention back. She was not a participant in the conversation, yet her presence dictated the gravity of the room. She was a silent anchor. Astra took a breath, letting the air fill his lungs without the need to exhale words. He let his shoulders drop. The urge to intervene subsided, replaced by a steady, observational clarity. He looked back at his guest, Sol, still watching, her eyes sharp and devoid of judgment, reminding him that the most powerful thing he could offer was the space for someone else to be heard. Astra's hand remained extended, pointing toward the heavy wooden chair. He did not say a word. He did not offer a soothing platitude or a promise of easy recovery. He simply waited. Kai stood frozen, his gaze darting from Astra's steady hand to the empty seat. He shifted his weight, his knuckles white as he gripped his own arms. He expected a lecture, a series of steps to follow, or perhaps a dismissal. The absence of these things hit him with more force than a command would have. He blinked, the confusion evident in the way his jaw tightened. He took a hesitant step forward, the floorboards creaking under his boots. He looked at Astra again, searching for the hidden trap. For the moment the advice would finally spill out. Astra remained motionless, his posture open, his face a neutral map of focus. The silence persisted, heavy and deliberate. Kai finally exhaled, a long, ragged sound that seemed to pull the tension from his shoulders. He walked to the chair and lowered himself into it. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, still braced for an instruction that did not arrive. The room felt smaller now, the distance between them closing, as Astra moved to sit opposite him, ready to listen rather than lead. Kai leaned forward, his hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists against his knees. He looked down at the grain of the wood, his jaw working as if he were chewing on bitter words. "Everyone says the same thing," he started, his voice cracking. "Just breathe. Just meditate. Just ignore the noise." He spat the words out, the frustration radiating from him in sharp, sudden movements. "They make it sound like a choice, like I can just flip a switch and turn off the world." He looked up at Astra, his eyes wide and searching, desperate for a sign that he was being heard. "They tell me to focus on the quiet, but the quiet does not exist for me. It is all static. It is all everyone else's sorrow, everyone else's panic, crashing into me until I cannot tell where I end and they begin." He stopped, his chest heaving with the effort of the admission. He shook his head, his hands trembling as he gestured to the air around him. Meditation is just another way to ignore the reality of what is happening. It does not work. It never works. It just makes me feel like I am failing at being human. The room held his anger, the silence no longer empty, but heavy with the weight of his exhaustion. Kai's knuckles turned pale as he squeezed his hands together, the friction audible in the quiet study. He stared at his own fingers, digging his nails into his palms until red crescents appeared. Every word he spoke seemed to require a physical struggle, a tearing away of layers he had spent years building. They tell me to find a center, he muttered, his voice dropping into a jagged rasp. But how do you center yourself when the world is constantly pulling you apart? He shifted, his chair scraping against the floorboards, a jarring sound that sliced through the stillness. His hands remained locked, a white-knuckled cage holding back the surge of his own panic. He looked up, his gaze darting toward the bookshelf where Saul stood, before locking back onto Astra. They treat it like a simple mechanical error, like a gear that just needs oiling. He slammed a fist into his palm, a sharp, sudden impact that made the nearby tea set rattle. It is not a gear, it is a flood. His breathing became shallow, his chest hitching with each intake of air. He leaned in, his face inches from the desk, his hands vibrating with the effort of containment. The room seemed to contract, the air thick with the residue of his anger and the raw, unpolished truth of his discomfort. Astra watched the tremors in Kai's hands. He did not reach for a pen. He did not offer a soothing platitude. Instead, he shifted his weight, leaning back until the chair creaked, and mirrored the stillness of the room. "That sounds exhausting," Astra said. The words were quiet, stripped of any forced comfort. They hung in the air, simple and direct. Kai froze. His hands, still locked in that white-knuckled grip, slowly began to relax, his fingers uncurling one by one against his palms. The frantic rhythm of his breathing faltered, then smoothed out into a deeper, slower cadence. He looked up, his eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on Astra. It was as if he had been bracing for a wall of advice and found a mirror instead. The defensive tension that had defined his posture for the last hour evaporated, leaving him slumped against the back of the chair. He let out a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate the entire room. He did not speak, but the desperation in his gaze had vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. He looked at Astra, then down at his own open hands, watching the blood return to his skin. For the first time, he was not fighting the air. He was simply sitting in it. Astra did not rush to fill the silence. He let the quiet settle into the corners of the study, watching the way the light shifted across the floorboards. Kai remained motionless, his hands resting flat on his knees, his focus turned inward. The frantic energy that had previously consumed the room had been replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. Astra leaned forward, his elbows resting on his thighs. He observed the way Kai's shoulders had dropped, the way his jaw had finally unclenched. He waited until Kai's gaze met his own, then he spoke. "What do you think is happening?" The question was not an inquiry for information. It was an invitation to look deeper. Astra held his position, his expression neutral, offering no guidance and no expectations. He watched as the words landed, seeing the flicker of uncertainty cross Kai's face. The burden of the answer was no longer on the guide. It was now squarely on the student. Kai blinked, his brow furrowing as he processed the shift. He looked away from Astra, his eyes scanning the room, then back to the empty space between them. The power had moved. The dialogue had changed from a search for a solution to an exploration of the self. The silence in the study was not empty. It was thick, pressing against the walls like rising water. Kai did not answer. He stared at the floorboards, his gaze tracing the grain of the wood as if searching for a hidden path. The clock on the mantel ticked, each beat echoing with unnatural clarity. Astra remained perfectly still, a silent observer in the shadows of the room. He watched the way Kai's brow tightened, the way his fingers curled into the fabric of his chair, then released again. The air in the room seemed to cool. Kai's focus was entirely withdrawn, his eyes unfocused as he navigated the labyrinth of his own perceptions. He shifted his weight, the leather of the chair groaning under the movement, but he did not look up. Every muscle in his frame was coiled, not with the frantic anxiety of before, but with the focused intensity of someone digging through layers of sediment to find a solid foundation. The pressure of the question was visible in the way he held his breath, in the slight tremor of his jaw, and in the deliberate, agonized slowness of his movements. He was standing at the edge of his own internal wreckage, deciding whether to look down or turn away. Astra waited, letting the weight of the moment deepen, knowing that the answer had to be forged in this exact, suffocating quiet. The stillness shifted. It was a subtle transformation, barely perceptible until Kai's chest stopped its jagged, uneven rising. He drew a long, deep breath that filled his lungs and held it for a heartbeat. When he let it out, the sound was thin and steady, lacking the previous ragged edge of panic. His hands, which had been white-knuckled against the chair, slowly relaxed. The tension drained from his shoulders, leaving him slumped forward in a state of sudden, profound exhaustion. This was not the collapse of a broken man, but the release of a weight he had carried for years. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, but the frantic darting had ceased. He blinked, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest becoming the only pulse in the room. He was no longer fighting the air. He was breathing with it. Astra watched from across the desk, noting the way the deep, measured inhalations smoothed the lines of strain from Kai's forehead. The air in the study seemed to circulate more freely, the oppressive density of the last hour evaporating. Kai's composure had returned, rebuilt from the inside out, anchored by the simple, undeniable act of his own steady lungs. The silence in the room no longer felt heavy. It was simply quiet. Kai remained still for a long moment, letting the new rhythm of his breath anchor him to the floorboards. He blinked, the fog in his gaze clearing as if a veil had been lifted. With a slow, deliberate movement, he placed his palms on the armrests and pushed himself up. He did not stumble. He did not hunch. He stood fully upright, his spine straight, his head lifting to meet the light filtering through the window. He looked around the study, his eyes lingering on the books, the desk, and finally, on Astra. There was no trace of the frantic energy that had defined his arrival. He turned toward the door, his movements fluid and purposeful. He stepped forward, his gait measured, each footfall landing firmly against the wood. He reached the threshold, paused, and looked back at the study. His shoulders were squared, his head held high. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and walked away with a steady, unwavering stride. Every step was his own. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a quiet, physical certainty that remained even after the door clicked shut behind him. The latch clicked into place, leaving the study in a sudden, ringing silence. Astra remained by the desk, his gaze lingering on the empty chair. He looked down at his own palms, flexed his fingers, and exhaled. The sound of soft footsteps broke the stillness. Sol crossed the room, her movements precise and soundless. She reached the small side table and began to pour tea into 2 cups. The liquid hit the porcelain with a steady, rhythmic splash. She slid 1 cup across the wood toward him. Her eyes remained focused on the rising steam. "You did not give him a single answer," she noted, her voice barely above a whisper. Astra looked at his hands, then back at the door. "He seemed to find his own," he replied. Sol stood straight, watching him with a calm, steady intensity. "People do not need maps," she said, her tone devoid of judgment. She gestured toward the room, then back at him. "They need a mirror." Astra held the cup, the heat radiating against his skin. He stood in the quiet, the weight of her words settling in the space between them. He had spent his life trying to provide the destination, only to realize he had been looking at the wrong tool. He took a slow, deliberate sip as the sunlight shifted across the floorboards. The sun rose, painting long, golden lines across the study floor. Astra stood by the window, watching the street wake up, when a sharp, rhythmic knock sounded against the door. He turned, the door opened, and Kai stepped inside. The change was immediate. His shoulders were no longer hunched against an invisible burden. He stood with his back straight, his gaze clear and fixed forward. He moved into the center of the room with a calm, deliberate pace, his feet planting firmly on the floorboards with each step. He stopped before the desk, meeting Astra's eyes without the flickering hesitation of the day before. He drew a deep, steady breath, filling his lungs without the ragged hitch that had marked his previous visit. "I stopped fighting the noise," Kai said, his voice level and resonant in the quiet room. He looked around, observing the space as if seeing it for the first time. "I spent the night listening to the silence instead of the crowd." He held his position, waiting, his hands resting naturally at his sides. The tension that had once defined his presence was entirely absent, replaced by a grounded focus. He looked at Astra, a faint nod acknowledging the shift. The study felt different. the air lighter, the space between them filled with a new, quiet strength. Kai stood motionless, the morning light catching the steady glint in his eyes. I asked myself what I was actually feeling, he continued, his tone devoid of the frantic energy from before. Much of it was not mine at all. It was just echoes of the world outside. He unclenched his hands, letting his fingers relax against his palms. The silence in the study grew profound, no longer heavy, but spacious. Astra smiled, a slow, genuine movement that reached his eyes. He leaned back, the wood of his chair creaking softly in the stillness. A palpable shift occurred in the room. The air felt thinner, cleaner, as if a weight had been lifted from the very floorboards. Astra watched the way Kai exhaled, a long, controlled release that signaled the end of his internal war. The ferns by the window seemed to sway in a sudden, gentle draft. There was no need for further questions or complex advice. The exhaustion that had clung to the space for weeks simply dissolved, replaced by a quiet, resonant peace. Kai looked at the desk, then at the bookshelves, his expression softening as he recognized the space for what it was, a sanctuary of his own making. The walls felt less like boundaries and more like a frame for his newfound clarity. Kai stepped closer to the desk, his posture open and attentive. "Can you teach me?" he asked, his voice steady. Astra did not answer immediately. He turned his head toward the corner where Sol stood by the crowded shelves. She held a ceramic teapot, her movements fluid and deliberate. She did not offer a lecture or a grand pronouncement. She simply tilted her head, a small, knowing nod that acknowledged the change in the air. Astra turned his focus back to Kai. He rested his hands flat on the desk, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palms. "I will not tell you who to be," Astra said, his tone firm yet gentle. "But I will walk beside you while you find out." He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the floor as he stood up. He walked around the desk, closing the distance until they stood side by side in the center of the study. The sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows across the floorboards. Outside, the rhythm of the city continued. But inside the room, the pace had slowed to a shared, deliberate stillness. Astra felt the weight of the previous months dissolve. There was no longer a need to hold the answers for someone else. They stood there, two men in a quiet room, ready to begin the work of discovery together. Astra walked to the window, his movements unhurried. He rested his palms against the cool frame and looked down at the street below. The world was in constant motion. A woman hurried past, clutching a letter with a frantic grip. A merchant barked prices at a crowd that barely listened. A child sat on the curb, weeping over a broken toy. Astra watched the familiar patterns of joy and grief unfolding on the cobblestones. For years, every flicker of distress in a passerby had landed in his own chest like a heavy stone. He braced himself, waiting for that familiar surge of phantom pain. It did not come. Instead, the sights remained external, discrete moments that belonged to the people living them. He saw the mother's frustration and the merchant's desperation, but he felt only the warmth of the afternoon sun on his skin. He was a spectator, not a vessel. The birds sang in the eaves, their notes sharp and clear against the hum of the city. He breathed in, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and let the chaos of the street drift past him like smoke. He was witnessing the world as it was, and for the first time that was enough. The room remained still, save for the soft sound of tea pouring into a cup. Sol moved from the shadows near the bookshelf, her footsteps silent against the floorboards. She stopped beside Astra, looking out at the same horizon. "Every great guide hopes to become unnecessary," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the rustle of the curtains. Astra turned his gaze from the street to her. He looked at his own hands, steady and empty, no longer clutching at the burdens of others. The weight he had carried for years had simply evaporated, replaced by the clarity of his purpose. He was not a leader of followers, nor a holder of secrets. He was a mirror. He looked back at the study, at the space where Kai had sat, and finally understood the nature of his strength. It was not in what he gave, but in what he allowed the other to see within themselves. Astra drew a long, slow breath and leaned back against the window frame. The city outside continued its frantic pace, but he was no longer part of its turbulence. He smiled, a small, quiet movement of the lips, and turned away from the glass. The lesson was complete. He was finally free.